Yes, my name is Bench and welcome back to Photoshop. We're continuing with our Photoshop Basics series. In this episode we'll be looking at gradients and the way we can use different layer blending modes and opacities to get some really cool effects and kind of fake some filters with our photo here. So we'll be continuing on from the previous document we created in the last episode, and we'll be jumping in with gradients. So we'll go over to our layers panel, and we want to create a new layer in between our frames layer and our photo layer. So we'll go down to the bottom and we're going to select the new layer button, and you see there it has created it. We can double click on it and call it gradient, and then we want to drag it between the frames and the image layer because we want our frame layer to be on the top at all times. So what is a gradient? Well, you know how a paint bucket fills and it just creates one color. A gradient creates a fade of color from one color to another color. To get to the gradient tool, we have to come over to where our paint bucket is, and we'll click and hold, and we go to the gradient tool. There it is there. You can see that it also has a hotkey G, like everything else in that particular panel, and so we can get there by hitting G, or we can toggle through the different options that we just saw by holding Shift and hitting the hotkey, in this case G. So that's a quick, handy little shortcut, and you'll learn these shortcuts as we go. Now you'll see as I toggle through the different controls or the different tools, this section just under the menu is changing, and that's because this section shows the settings for the tool that I have currently selected. So I've ended here on the gradient tool, and you can see we have all these settings above. So the settings that we'll show you is this setting here is a drop down where you can define the different colors and opacities for your gradient. In this case, we've just got it going from black to white or white to black. The next section shows you the different types of gradients that you can create. Now, to give you a better idea, I've enlarged it here so you can see them. So we've got a linear gradient, which is a gradient going from one side to another. A radial gradient, which is one color going outwards in a circular pattern to the edge. An angle gradient, where you go from the center and then go out, and it's like the gradient starts at one color and spins all the way around to another color. The reflected gradient, which is similar to our linear gradient, but on both sides, going from the inside out. And then the diamond, where it's also similar to the radial gradient, but it has this sort of boxy look with points, and it's very interesting. So that is the different gradients that we have at our disposal. Now, if we go back up to our settings panel, you'll see we have mode, and this is blending modes for the actual gradient itself. And you'll understand what blending modes are when we get into it later on in the video. But it is also awesome to note that you've got them right here in your gradient settings for when you're creating a gradient directly on an image. Similarly, you've got the opacity, but generally speaking, the way I like to do it is these settings here, I'll just keep using over in our layers and just keep it as a gradient on a separate layer rather than going directly on an image. That way, if you want to adjust it, you can. We'll now look at the checkbox here, which is called reverse, and you can see that reverses the pattern or the gradient direction. Next we have diver and transparency. These things just adjust some of the quality settings and the way things are laid out in the layers panel, but generally speaking, leave both of them on and you'll be fine. So, what does it look like when we draw a gradient? Well, there we go. We've just drawn one, and you'll see if I zoom in and draw it again, I click on one point where I want my first color to appear, and then I drag it out to the next point. And there's a line that gets drawn between them, kind of showing the direction that that gradient will go. For a linear gradient, it shows sort of the direction of the banding, where it fades between the two. If I go to the radial gradient and draw it from the center out, you can see that it's me drawing the radius of that circle. If I draw the angle, you'll see it draws that line along the edge that I have drawn. If I grab the reflected, you'll see it now goes out and also in the opposite direction. And finally, if I grab the diamond and I draw it, you'll see that my line that I draw out kind of sets where one of these lines will appear. So if we go back to our linear gradient, you can see that's the look that I've created there. But what if I want to make it transparent? Well, if we hit Control A, we can select everything in this layer. We can also do that by going up the top and going to select all. And we're just going to delete it so we have space to draw our layer again. Now we can deselect by going to select in the menu and then deselect, or we can also hit Control D. So now we've gotten rid of the gradient that was originally on that layer, and we can look at the settings. So to bring up the settings, we go to the gradient tool, and then we're just going to click on the box that shows us a preview of our gradient. And here it is, the gradient editor. You can see here we've got a number of different options. We've got these presets built into it. We can even save our own presets if you like. We can see what this one is called. So you can see as I click through, different things load up, and you can start getting a general idea as to how this works. We create colors on the bottom, and we can define opacities on the top, so fading it to transparent or not. We'll go back to the foreground to background one, and you can see we've got these 4 points. This let us define the color on the bottom layer. So if I click on them, you can see I get color, and the top lets me set the opacity, so 100 and 100. If I go to the next one, which is foreground to transparent, you'll see that if I click on the bottom, both of them are black, but the top one is 0 and one is 100. So this is just the transitions that you can see happening. I can click between and add new points. So I can double click on the color to change the color. And I can click above to add a transparency that I can fade in and out. I can also click and drag them away from the bar to get rid of them. So we'll go to foreground to transparent because what we want to create is a vignette. So we're going to hit OK. And we'll zoom back out, and we want to create a radial vignette, but we don't want the black to start in the center, so we're going to reverse it. So the rule of thumb is whichever is on the left hand side of our settings up there is whatever is going to be what is where we're initially clicking. So let's draw a vignette, which is basically a darkening around the edges. As it heads towards the center, it becomes more transparent. So we'll draw it like so, and you can see, there we go, we've got a basic vignette. We can hide our guides by hitting Control H, or Command H, I think it is on the Mac. And then if we go over to our panel on the side, we can change the opacity. So the opacity is how opaque to transparent something is. So you can see if I go to 0, it's no longer visible. And if I fade it up, you can start seeing it more and more. Now we'll drop it down to somewhere like there, or 50, and there we go, we have a basic vignette. You can see what that looks like, the difference that makes as I toggle it on and off. You can see it's a lot more defined around the edges. But what if we want to go a step further? Well, that's when we can apply blending modes. And we'll zoom in like so we can see what we're doing. And we'll just drag this over to the side here. So blending modes are found next to opacity in the layers menu. You can see they are all here. There's quite a few of them, and we're not going to go in depth as to what they all do or how the mathematics work, but they all affect the way that this layer, the gradient layer, renders or mixes onto the layers below it. So the top section refers to the way that it uses its transparency. So if I go to dissolve, you can see now it kind of has one of those dissolve from iMovie or Windows Movie Maker. If I go back to normal, it looks normal again. Now this section in here, these 5 refer to making your image darker by the way that the colors or the values of this layer affect the layer below it. Lighten, again, it's focused on lightening. Overlay through to hard mix. These are more referring to the way that it creates contrast by combining that layer with the layers below it. Difference, exclusion, subtract and divide. Again, they relate to the way the colors mix together from the layer that I'm selecting this for and the layers below it. And you'll be able to play around with those to get some really interesting looks, as we will as well as we head more into the video. And then finally, hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. These are the different aspects of an image, or color, or pixels, whatever you want to refer them to. And this affects how we apply that particular value from this layer to the layers below it. We can try to explain it as much as possible, but the best way to learn is just by doing. So we'll go to overlay, and you can see it definitely changes. So our opacity is at 100, but you can see now it's not so dark and black and grey, it's a lot more subtle. If I toggle it on and off, you can definitely see it down in this section of our image as well, the difference that makes. It kind of has a little bit more darkening and then a little bit more bright around the edge. If I go to soft light, you can see it does the same thing again, only it's a lot more subtle. If I go down to something like hard light, you see it's a lot harsher there. And there's all these other options. Some you will not notice the difference with until you start adding color into your images. For now, let's leave it on overlay, and we're going to create a new layer again. This will be our filter layer. So we'll double click it and we'll call it filter. And we're going to try out some of the options, other options that we have for our image. So we'll go back to the gradient tool and let's grab this one here. So we'll click on the purple or the violet to orange actual gradient. And we'll do a linear gradient this time. So we'll draw it out across the screen like so, and there we go. So we've got this image with our filter, and we'll put it over here so we can see what happens when we change blending modes. And we'll just slowly cycle through the blending modes so you can see the difference that those make. So you can see darken and multiply and color burn, they really do some changes. But even when we go darken and multiply, you can see darken just keeps these dark colors from the original image and then the dark colors from everything else. Multiply kind of combines everything together. Color burn is really saturated. Linear burn, you lose a lot as well, it's quite dark. And darker color, it's just picking the darker color from each of these layers. If I go to lighten, you can see instead of darkening, it's lightening these lighter areas. Screen, you get a lot more detail back and it's lightened. Color dodge, again, you get that really high saturation and almost bleaching in this white area. Linear dodge, or also known as add, does a very similar thing as well. Lighter color as well, you can see it does it there. Overlay, and this is where we start getting into some cool effects as well. Soft light is very nice and subtle. Hard light, it's a lot more obvious. Vivid light, again, is similar to that contrasting. Linear light, pin light. Hard mix, and then we start getting into the way that it pulls color out and starts doing dark or white or combinations of hues and stuff. And you can see even here, you're starting to get some effects that really are reminiscent of sort of those filters that you can see in programs. So have a play around with this. You can see there's like soft light, and again, using the opacities, you can get some really subtle, nice differences. So if we select gradient, and we're going to hold shift and select filter as well, and we'll toggle them both off, you can see the difference that even just combining those two gradients with those blending modes make. Again, if we grab the filter and say go to hue and bump up the opacity, again you can see there's like this blue and stuff. And so you get some really cool effects. And that's just with one gradient. If you were to say select another one, or we'll even create our own where we go in there and create, say, we make it like a blue to a very light blue and draw that gradient on. And again, do similar effects. You can see we get quite a cool look. And that's very different to, again, the image we got. And the benefit of using Photoshop is if we look over here, we can easily go back to our previous image, and you can see the difference that makes on the original image that we created. So that is gradients and creating them with new layers and using different blending modes to blend things together. For one final thing, we'll show you just how crazy you can get with the difference, exclusion, subtract, and divide. But we're going to pick a really, like a subtle dark blue, like so. So we'll grab our fill tool and fill that layer. And we'll just go to exclusion. And you can see here that gives us quite a muted look for that image. If we go back to the other one and toggle between them, you can see it has that really sort of old school look. We can also toggle between these and get some different looks again. Alright, divide's a bit too washed out, but exclusion, you'll find that playing around with some really dark tones can get you some really interesting looks that look really vintagey between our different images. So that is gradients and the different blending modes and opacities that you can use and apply to your image to get some really interesting effects. Well, that's it for another Photoshop Basics tutorial. If you're enjoying this series, don't forget to subscribe, and we'll keep going in the next video. Until next time, my name is Bench. Thanks for watching.